In 1965, at just 22 years old, an age when most of us are still figuring out our lives in college, Paul Butterfield stood on the legendary Newport stage and permanently changed the sound of music history. But destiny dealt a cruel hand. The storm he unleashed would roar for only 22 years. He passed away in 1987 at the age of 44, and in those numbers lies a chilling, perfect symmetry. His entire trailblazing career lasted for exactly half of his tragically short life. He was the candle that burned at both ends, a brilliant flame extinguished far too soon. But where was this brilliant, short-lived flame first ignited? To truly understand the ferocious, guarded soul of Paul Butterfield, one must first walk the streets of his Chicago, not the glamorous city of skyscrapers and magnificent miles, but the tense, fractured, and brutally segregated city of the post-war era. Paul von Butterfield was born on December 17, 1942, and grew up in Hyde Park, a unique neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. It was an island, an intellectually vibrant and racially diverse enclave, surrounded by a sea of simmering racial tension. Home to the prestigious University of Chicago, Hyde Park was a bubble of progressive thought, art, and academia. His father, John Butterfield, was a prominent lawyer. His mother, Elizabeth, was a painter. It was a home of books, art, and ideas, a cultured, if emotionally reserved environment. But outside their door, Chicago was a city of invisible, yet violently real, dividing lines. The post-war boom had drawn hundreds of thousands of African Americans from the rural South in the Great Migration, all seeking opportunity and fleeing Jim Crow oppression. They brought with them their culture and their music, the blues, and concentrated it in the sprawling ghettos of the South and West Sides. For a white family in Hyde Park, this other world was geographically close, but culturally a universe away. From a young age, Paul was a study in contradictions. He was a gifted natural athlete, a fleet-footed track star who was good enough to eventually earn a scholarship to the esteemed Brown University. Simultaneously, he was a dedicated and serious musician, but his path was classical. He became a classically trained flutist, studying under the tutelage of Walfrid Kujala, a distinguished member of the world-renowned Chicago Symphony Orchestra. This was a path of discipline, precision, and respectability. He had all the makings of a conventional, successful life laid out before him, but there was another current running through him, something deeper, more solitary, and more primal. His brother, Peter Butterfield, recalled in the poignant documentary Horn from the Heart, the Paul Butterfield story, that Paul's true passion was a lonely one. He would spend countless hours by himself wandering the parks and lakefront of Chicago, just him and his harmonica. Peter described the process perfectly. He'd listen to the records and be out and about, but he would also spend a great deal of time by himself playing. It was a very solitary effort. It was all internal, like he had a particular sound he was after and was just working to get it. This image is the absolute key to unlocking the man he would become. This was not a social activity. It was not about jamming with friends. It was a private, obsessive quest. This solitary pursuit wasn't just musical practice. It was a search for self, an effort to create an internal world of order and meaning that he could control, in stark contrast to the complex and often painful world outside. The harmonica became his sole confidant, the tool through which he could have a dialogue with himself. His phenomenal talent was forged in the fires of this self-imposed solitude. The sensitivity and the deep-seated need to retreat into a private world became the very foundation of his extraordinary gift. But they also cemented an emotional isolation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As a teenager, he made a decision that was, for his family and his background, an act of profound rebellion. He turned his back on the flute, on the track scholarship to an Ivy League school, and on the respectable future that seemed his birthright. He was inexorably drawn to a sound that was everything his classical training was not. The raw, visceral, electrically charged blues emanating from the city's south side. This was the Forbidden Kingdom, the authentic heart of Black American music, a living, breathing world populated by legends like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Little Walter, and Otis Spann. His decision to pursue the blues was not just a career choice, it was an escape of the soul. He was abandoning a world of clear rules and societal approval for a world of raw emotion, of pain, and of redemption. The world of the blues seemed to be the only place that could understand the chaos brewing inside him. This decision was more than a choice of genre. It was the beginning of a pilgrimage, one that would demand a heavy price for the authenticity he craved. In the late 1950s, the young Paul Butterfield began his legendary pilgrimage. He started crossing the invisible, heavily policed lines of segregation to venture into the heart of the South Side, the true home of Chicago blues. This was not a casual field trip or a musical safari. This was an act of profound defiance, a pilgrimage to the source. The clubs of the South Side, gritty, smoke-filled venues like Pepper's Lounge and Teresa's Lounge, were harsh, unforgiving environments, not built for the faint of heart. They were community centers, refugees where Black Chicagoans could hear their music, speak their language, and escape the pressures of a racist society. To survive in this world, let alone be accepted, Butterfield knew he couldn't just be a polite white kid with a harmonica. He had to build a shell, an armor. It was here that the conflict between his talent and his soul began to manifest in earnest. For his talent to be recognized in this environment, he had to sacrifice a piece of his youthful innocence. He had to become tough, hard-edged, even dangerous. His future musical partner, the brilliant guitarist Mike Bloomfield, who was on a similar journey from a well-to-do North Shore background, remembered his first impressions of Butterfield in those early days. He was a bad guy. He carried a gun. He was down on the South Side. I was scared to death of that cat. This wasn't just posturing. It was a profound psychological transformation. Butterfield donned the armor of a true bluesman to protect the sensitive soul within. The problem, which would define his life, was that over time, the armor fused to his skin. He needed authenticity to play the music he loved, and to gain that authenticity, he had to live the life. A defensive posture became his second nature. Aloofness became a survival mechanism. As his friend and producer Norman Darren described him, he was hard-edged and unfriendly. He adopted a uniform of black clothes and sunglasses, shrouding himself in a self-made darkness. It was the first price he paid. He didn't just observe, he participated with an unnerving intensity. He sat at the feet of the masters, absorbing every note, every nuance, every drop of pain and joy. He earned their respect, a feat almost unheard of for a white musician at the time. Muddy Waters, the undisputed king of Chicago blues, famously and affectionately called Paul his son, a paternal blessing that conferred upon him an unparalleled degree of legitimacy. Even his playing style became a symbol of his struggle. Being left-handed, he held the harmonica upside down, with the low notes to the right. This forced him to develop a unique but incredibly difficult technique to bend notes and achieve the effects he heard in his head. Every note he played was the result of a physical battle, a victory over the instrument's limitations. It was a perfect metaphor for his own life. His music was born from conflict. By the turn of the decade, the boy who sought refuge in a solitary sound had become a man who found it almost impossible to let anyone in. The foundation for a lifetime of tragic spiritual loneliness was already firmly in place. Having forged both a unique sound and an ironclad persona to protect it, Butterfield had reached a critical turning point. The solitary quest that had defined his youth was over. The sound he had chased down the lonely corridors of his own mind was now too powerful to remain contained. He was ready to unleash it, but a storm this immense could not be summoned by one man alone. And so by 1963, he made a choice that would defy his solitary nature. He wouldn't do it the easy way. He formed the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, a decision that was as much a defiant political statement in a segregated America as it was a groundbreaking musical one. In the midst of the civil rights movement, at a time when America was violently confronting its legacy of racism, Butterfield created one of the first truly integrated, high-profile bands in modern music. He didn't just hire any black musicians. He went straight to the source, performing an act of almost unthinkable audacity. He recruited the rhythm section of the legendary Howlin' Wolf himself, Jerome Arnold on bass and Sam Lay on drums. This wasn't just borrowing the sound, he was hiring the engine, the very heartbeat of the Chicago blues. He poached the bedrock of one of the greatest blues bands in history. The lineup was initially completed by the addition of another white musician who shared his obsession, the fiery and talented guitarist Elvin Bishop. Soon after, they were joined by the prodigy who would become Butterfield's perfect musical foil, Mike Bloomfield. The combination was explosive. It was a collision of worlds. The raw gut bucket authenticity and deep pocket groove of the Southside rhythm section, and the technically brilliant rock-infused firepower of the two white guitarists, all anchored and driven by the ferocious, uncompromising vision of Butterfield himself. This leadership role, however, placed an immense burden on his young shoulders. He was no longer just responsible for the music. He was responsible for the safety and dignity of his black bandmates as they toured a country still rife with segregation and prejudice. His career, from its very inception, was a battlefield. The hard shell he had forged on the South Side was now an essential tool for protecting his band. His role as a leader demanded he be a warrior, which further suppressed the sensitive artist within, encasing him ever more deeply in cynicism and defensiveness. The band's proving ground was a Chicago club called Big John's on the North Side. It was there, through marathon sets night after night, that they forged their sound into a weapon. Their live shows became the stuff of legend, loud, relentless, and electrifyingly intense. This wasn't the polite academic blues revivalism popular in coffee houses. As one observer famously put it, it sounded like a bar fight. It was the roar of Butterfield's amplified harmonica, played with the force and technique of a horn player, locked in a death-defying duel with Bloomfield's screaming, lightning-fast guitar runs. It was a conversation of pure, uncut aggression and soul, a sound that Chicago and the world had never heard before. The storm had gathered and was waiting to break. In the summer of 1965, it would finally make landfall on the most unlikely of shores, the Newport Folk Festival. This was sacred ground for acoustic purity and political earnestness, a world presided over by folk purists like Pete Seeger and Alan Lomax, making it the perfect stage for a revolution. The Butterfield Band's loud, amplified urban blues performance was seen as nothing short of heresy. They were the sonic shock wave that hit the beach just before the cultural tidal wave that was Bob Dylan's infamous Electric set, a set for which the Butterfield Band, minus Butterfield himself but including Bloomfield, Arnold, and Lay, served as the backing band. In that single revolutionary weekend, Paul Butterfield went from being a Chicago legend to a figure of national importance. Newport was not just a concert, it was his coronation. He was anointed the undisputed king of the emerging white blues movement. He was no longer just a musician, he was a pioneer, a revolutionary. He was the gatekeeper, and he had just kicked the door to the future wide open. But every crown is heavy. He now carried the burden of being a standard bearer, the benchmark against which all others would be measured. Every performance, every note became a test of his authenticity. This pressure intensified the war between his talent and his soul. His talent demanded a colossal stage energy, a nightly exhibition of raw, bared emotion. But his soul was fundamentally introverted, constantly seeking to hide itself from the world. To perform with such devastating power night after night, he had to dredge the well of his own inner pain and anger. This process was fundamentally unsustainable. He was burning his soul as fuel to illuminate his talent. Alcohol and soon other stimulants became the necessary accelerants to keep that fire blazing. The bad guy mask he had worn for survival was now permanently affixed for his performance. He was also caught in an impossible cultural crossfire. To some in the black community, he was a white interloper, another example of cultural appropriation. To a still conservative white America, he was a race mixer, fronting a salt and pepper band that defied social norms. This external pressure only exacerbated his internal anxieties, reinforcing the defensive, hard-edged persona he had cultivated since his youth. He was always intense, sometimes remote, and often, as all music noted, downright unfriendly. As the pressure of being a standard bearer and the painful realities of the blues became too confining, his talent sought an escape, not a physical one, but a profound artistic and psychological flight. For Paul Butterfield, the quest for authenticity was the driving force of his youth. But once he was crowned king at Newport, that authenticity transformed from a noble goal into a psychological prison. The title of King of White Blues became both a crown and a curse. It was a burden that demanded he not only play the blues flawlessly, but also somehow embody its spirit, a spirit born from a history of suffering he had never known. This was the pioneer's curse. With every performance, he felt an immense pressure to constantly prove his legitimacy, to justify his right to stand on that stage. A subtle, insidious belief may have taken root in his soul that for his music to remain real, his life must contain a measure of pain. The blues he loved was the language of hardship, and perhaps on some unconscious level, he felt that suffering was a necessary sacrifice for the art. Joy was for pop music. The blues required a pound of flesh. From this perspective, his descent into self-destruction can be seen as more than just a coping mechanism for stress. It became an unconscious ritual of affirmation. Every drink, every destructive act served to validate his identity as a true bluesman, distancing him from the comfortable middle-class background that was his original sin in this world. He could not be a happy, well-adjusted man from Hyde Park who just happened to play the blues. That felt like a fraud. He had to become the blues. The alcohol and drugs weren't just an escape. They were a baptism, a way to wash away the privilege and suffer his way into the authenticity he craved. His tragedy is that he succeeded too perfectly. He fused his identity with his art until there were no borders left, no escape. He was no longer a man playing the blues. He was the blues embodied in a man, and he was therefore bound to its cycle of pain, loss, and fleeting redemption until the very end. Paul Butterfield's deepest tragedy lies in the unending war between his inner self and his performing talent. At his core, his inner self was a solitary, introverted and sensitive man who found peace when he was alone with his harmonica. But his talent demanded the absolute opposite. It craved the stage, it craved attention, and it could only exist by exposing his rawest, most intense emotions before thousands of people. For him, every performance was an act of tearing himself apart. The stage was both a sanctuary and a life or death arena. It was the only place his talent was truly liberated, but it was also where his inner self was tortured. To be able to walk out and perform with such tempestuous energy, the shy boy of his youth had to be buried deep, and another persona had to be created. Paul Butterfield, the blues legend, a tough, defiant, and dangerous man. This persona needed fuel to survive. Alcohol and stimulants were not merely tools for recreation, they were essential performance tools. They helped him numb his sensitivity, extinguish the fears of his inner self, and unleash the stage monster. Each performance became an act of self-immolation, a ritual where his spirit was the price paid for his genius. And when the performance was over, when the stage lights went dark, what remained was a depleted void. The bluesman persona had vanished, leaving only an inner self that was even more broken and isolated. This explains why he could not sustain intimate relationships. He couldn't be a dedicated husband or father because the best, most authentic part of his being was sacrificed nightly on the stage. In the end, his talent won, but that victory demanded the price of his entire being. The band's second album, 1966's East West, represented a creative zenith, but it can also be viewed as a profound act of psychological escape. The title track, a groundbreaking 13-minute instrumental epic, shattered the traditional 12-bar blues structure. It was a sprawling, modal, psychedelic journey that incorporated influences from Indian raga, John Coltrane's avant-garde jazz, and pure freeform improvisation. This was more than just musical innovation. It was a flight of the soul. The rigid, repetitive structure of the blues, with its familiar loops and lyrical themes of loss and betrayal, may have become too confining, too close a mirror to the painful cycles in his own life. East-West was a flight into abstraction, an attempt by his talent to break free from the shackles of a suffering soul. It was a way to express profound emotion without having to confront it directly through the painful words of a traditional blues song. It was a new language, invented when the old one became too painful to speak. While Bloomfield was the primary architect of the track's structure, Butterfield's wailing, exploratory harp was its spiritual core, a cry that transcended words. The album was a monumental artistic achievement that would influence countless bands, from the Allman Brothers Band to the Grateful Dead, but for its leader, it was a temporary, masterful act of escapism. But this masterful act of escapism on vinyl could not save him from the corrosive reality that awaited him off stage: the road, the needle, and the empty room. The band's success meant a life lived on the road, endless tours, countless nights in anonymous hotel rooms, long, grueling days spent in a cramped tour bus. It was during this period that the conflict between career and family began to tear his life apart. His career demanded he be a nomadic warrior. It required his presence on a stage in a different city every night. But his family, his first wife Virginia and their children, Billy and Tess, required his presence at home. He could not be in both places at once, and his career almost always won. The loneliness of the road is a real and corrosive force. Surrounded by his band and adoring fans, he was still fundamentally alone. And in that corrosive loneliness, addiction found fertile ground. Heroin, the drug he had strictly forbidden within his band, began to enter his life. Initially, it may have been a way to manage the physical toll of performing, but more deeply, it was a balm for the pain of his soul. It was a substitute for intimacy, a way to fill the void left by his fractured family, a way to quiet the guilt of being an absent husband and father. His immense talent required a touring career to sustain it. That career destroyed his family life. That familial destruction, in turn, annihilated his soul. It was a tragic, inescapable feedback loop. The relentless abuse of alcohol, various uppers and downers, and the poor eating habits of life on the road began to take a severe toll on his body. By 1971, exhausted by the road, riddled with internal conflict, and strained by the clashing egos of two prodigious talents in Butterfield and Bloomfield, who had left in 1967, the classic lineup of the band disintegrated. The storm had left its indelible mark on the world, but as the music journal Louder Sound noted, it had left its creator feeling creatively lost. Feeling creatively lost after the original storm had passed, Butterfield sought a new path, attempting to find a semblance of peace in a new band and a new home. After the breakup of his iconic band, Butterfield attempted to find a new path, a semblance of peace. In 1971, he formed a new group, Paul Butterfield's Better Days, featuring a more relaxed, roots-oriented sound. He bought a house in the bucolic musicians' enclave of Woodstock, New York, remarried a woman named Catherine, and had a son, Lee. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though he might find the tranquility that had always eluded him. But the demons of his past and the fundamental architecture of his personality were not so easily shaken. He was a man built for the road, for the transient, chaotic life of a performing musician. He was Paul Butterfield, the blues legend. He did not know how to be simply Paul, the husband and father. The quiet demands of domestic life felt alien and stifling. The career continued to call, and he answered. The tours resumed, and once again his family was relegated to a distant second place. Friends and family in Horn from the Heart described this painful period with brutal honesty, labeling him as self-destructive and narcissistic, a man who consistently put his own needs and the demands of his music above the needs of his children. It was a failing he would later come to regret bitterly, but by then, the damage was done. Another marriage ended in divorce, and he became painfully estranged from his children. This is perhaps the deepest layer of the Butterfield tragedy. The very solitary nature that had allowed him to master his instrument as a boy now rendered him incapable of sustaining the deep, lasting human connections that require vulnerability and openness, qualities he had long ago buried under layers of scar tissue. His brother Peter's memory of him spending hours alone with his harmonica became a prophecy for his entire life. He was a man often surrounded by people, but fundamentally, devastatingly alone. He had chosen his career, and the price was his family. With his family life in ruins and his soul more isolated than ever, the internal war he had fought for decades began to manifest externally in the most brutal way. His own body became a battlefield. By the late 1970s, Butterfield's internal war began to manifest itself externally in a catastrophic physical decline. His body began to betray him. He was diagnosed with chronic peritonitis, a painful and debilitating inflammation of the thin membrane that lines the abdominal wall. It was an earthly hell. This disease was not a random misfortune. It was the tangible physiological result of years of relentless self-destruction. The constant stress of his career, the corrosive effects of alcohol and drug abuse, the very tools he used to fuel his talent and numb his soul, had pushed his body to a breaking point where it began to attack itself. The physical pain was immense and constant. The condition required multiple invasive surgeries and left him having to wear a colostomy bag, a profound indignity for a man whose public persona was built on power and unassailable toughness. As New England public media noted in its review of his life, alcohol, opiates, emergency surgeries, and hospitalizations for peritonitis all contributed to a long, painful decline. This physical agony became the gateway to his final fatal addiction. The unbearable pain pushed him fully into the arms of heroin. The tragic circle was now complete. He began with a soul in pain, and now his soul and his body were a single ravaged battlefield. As the journal Blues Access reported, Butterfield was showing signs of a serious drug problem, and there's no doubt that the years of drinking were beginning to take their toll on him physically. His finances were in ruins. His longtime manager, the legendary Albert Grossman, paid for therapy and interventions, but nothing worked. The hard-edged, powerful young man who had taken the Chicago blues scene by storm was now, as Rolling Stone would later describe him, a shadow of himself. The blues were no longer just his music. They had become his grim reality. As he became a shadow of his former self, trapped in this grim reality, the final support structures of his world began to crumble one by one, leaving him utterly alone for the final coda. The final years of Paul Butterfield's life were a heartbreaking litany of loss. The support structures that had held his world together, however tenuously, began to crumble one by one. In 1981, his musical partner, his rival, his brother-in-arms, Mike Bloomfield, died of a heroin overdose. The death of the man who had stood beside him during his greatest triumphs was said to have shaken him to his core. In 1986, his longtime manager and protector, Albert Grossman, also passed away. He was increasingly adrift, isolated by his pain and his addiction. These losses only pushed him deeper into the abyss. He was trapped in a vicious cycle, the physical pain of his condition, and the drug use meant to numb it, which only further destroyed his body. He still performed occasionally, and in fleeting moments the old genius would shine through. Just days before his death, he played a gig, sitting in with a young Stevie Ray Vaughan. It was a symbolic passing of the torch. But those who heard him that night noted that his voice sounded like that of a man 25 years his senior, a voice ravaged by years of abuse. The limitless opportunities of his youth were gone, lost to addiction, illness, and despair. On May 4th, 1987, Paul Butterfield was found dead in his North Hollywood apartment. The Los Angeles County Coroner's report confirmed what many had long feared: an accidental overdose of a toxic cocktail of morphine, heroin, codeine, the anti-anxiety drug Librium, and alcohol. He was 44 years old. His death was the tragic final note of a life defined by the blues. To look back on that life is to look at a destiny forged in paradox. To look back on the life of Paul Butterfield is to look at a destiny forged in paradox. His talent was the key that unlocked a door of cultural exchange for an entire generation, a legacy that cannot be overstated. The door he kicked open in the 1960s has never been closed, and his musical innovations echoed through decades of music that followed. But the lonely, sensitive soul that forged that talent was the very thing that made him unable to enjoy its fruits. His career elevated him to the status of a legend, but in the process, it cost him a peaceful family life. As his friend, singer Maria Muldaur, said with heartbreaking clarity, he embodied what the blues was all about. Unfortunately, he lived that lifestyle a little too much. That is the ultimate tragic brilliance of Paul Butterfield. His death was the final devastating proof of his authenticity. He didn't just appropriate the blues, he was consumed by them. The loneliness, the hard shell, the fame, the pain, it all poured into his harmonica, creating a sound that was terrifyingly real. He was the key that unlocked the blues for the world, but he couldn't find the key to unlock himself. He gave everything to the music, and in the end, the music took all he had left, leaving a legacy that is both a glorious triumph and a profound cautionary tale.